Well, I suppose his work is hugely varied, but I suppose what binds it together in many ways is this interest in um, the agency of cultural practice, I suppose we could say, and really, I suppose, probing that potential tension between to what extent is our practice driven by individual agency and to what extent is it shaped by the structures around us. And I think he's trying to steer a middle path between that notion of kind of individual agency and structured behaviours. I guess many people would say that he's not necessarily doing anything hugely original there. He's drawing on lots of other people who've gone before him. But I think what makes him so interesting from my point of view is the way that he consistently exposes the myths, I suppose the hidden stakes behind cultural practice, the incentives that drive people that often we don't notice. So he very much kind of bursts this notion of the charismatic genius artist, which people are still very wedded to in academia, the genius poet, and instead exposes all the kind of social constraints and social conventions that sustain those myths. So for me, it's about kind of myth busting from a sociological perspective. So, and I forget which scholar it is exactly who talks about Bourdieu as a kind of radical theory of context. I suppose that's interesting and important because it prevents us from thinking about the isolated work of art or work of literature on its own terms. Rather, kind of Bourdieu encourages us to look at the kind of hinterland, all the things that are behind that text, how it came into being, but also, and I guess this is the kind of Marxist perspective really where he's coming from, the conditions in which those objects circulate as goods that are connected to material capital, economic capital, but crucially for Bourdieu, that carry this extra dimension of symbolic capital. So he reminds us not just to look at the poet, the author, the artist, but also to look at the publisher, the literary agent, the gallery director, what's in it for them, why are they promoting that particular work of art, the reviewer, how does and why is it the case that if the reviewer reviews it in a certain way, it sustains the reputation of the work of art, what's in it for them. So I think what's great about Bourdieu is it reminds us to go and look at all those contextual dimensions and join them up. So together with a colleague, I wrote a periodical, a history of a literary cultural magazine from the German Democratic Republic, from socialist East Germany, a journal called Sinn und Form, which was founded in 1949 and is still being published today. So what makes Bourdieu attractive for analysing a cultural magazine, of course, is that a magazine is not just a literary object. It's very much a socio-cultural institution with a whole range of actors and agents associated with it, the contributors, the readers, the editors, and so it really gave us that kind of holistic framework in which to consider a literary magazine. In the arts methods session on Bourdieu, I do talk the students through in quite a lot of detail my own research, the way that we applied Bourdieu in that particular case to this particular literary magazine. I think the importance of doing that is theory has no purpose as an end in itself, and so I think you want to show researchers that there's a practical application here that actually illuminates your object of inquiry. I mean, that's what theory is for. Hopefully you understand the object of inquiry better, you see things, you gain insight into it because you've applied the theory. So we certainly don't sit there and kind of contemplate Bourdieu as an end in itself. It's very much a means to a productive analysis. But I think it's also a session, hopefully, that gives students an insight into how you use theory at all. Why do we use theory? How do we use theory? Because I think there's a real danger. There's almost a kind of formulaic approach. Your supervisor says you have to go away and find a theoretical framework. You find a theoretical framework, you write about that in a chapter, and then you do your analysis, and the two can often be very disjointed. And I do think that's a danger with students when they apply Bourdieu, that you get an analysis, in some senses, almost not an analysis, where all it is kind of dropping in the technical terms, and therefore we see this author gains capital, and it really doesn't kind of work like that. at all. I think you've got to show how it's productive, show how it actually helps us to understand your object more clearly. So hopefully it's as much a session about how you use theory as how you use Bourdieu, I would hope. I think one of the things with Bourdieu is that the elaboration and discussion of some of the theoretical concepts is spread out amongst his writing, and it's not necessarily easy to go to the place where he defines habitus, say, partly because the definitions vary depending on exactly how you're using it. So I don't think you should necessarily expect I'm going to find this is the place where the field is defined. These terms are often used, I suppose, defined through their use. But I think it's important to see that as a positive as well, because it gives you the flexibility to define it as it works for you. One really good place to start with for Bourdieu is the forms of capital. Relatively short essay in which he does set out some of the really kind of key concepts and how they relate to one another. So what are the different forms of capital? What are the different species of capital? How do they exist? So he talks about cultural capital, he talks about social capital in there, and I've certainly found his treatment of social capital actually hugely useful in terms of analysing groups of actors, groups of cultural agents and how they function together. So there were some really quite straightforward, I think, examples in there. And of course that always helps to start to try and understand the language which he's using to talk about them, because they're examples that you can identify with. But it's also a good text because it really, I think, enables you to see the kind of questions you need to be asking, which are not just about identifying a form of capital, but asking how is it transferred, how is it exchanged, to what extent can it be exchanged, when it is transferred, what are the losses? So of course capital can be transferred from one form to another, but that's associated with loss very often. I think that's the kind of approach that gives the depth and the complexity to the analysis which is really necessary, I think.